High above the city of Athens, on a flat-topped rock that rises nearly 150 meters above sea level, stands one of the most remarkable collections of ancient structures the world has ever known. It has survived wars, earthquakes, explosions, occupation, and the slow, relentless passage of more than 2,500 years. And yet it still stands. Scarred, yes. Weathered, certainly. But standing, proud, enduring, and as powerful in its presence today as it was in the golden age that gave it life. This is the Acropolis of Athens. The word itself comes from two ancient Greek words, akron, meaning the highest point, and polis, meaning city, the high city. And for the ancient Athenians, that is precisely what it was, not merely a hill, not merely a collection of stone temples, but the very soul of their civilization, a place where the sacred and the civic met, where gods were honored, where power was displayed, and where people announced to the world who they were and what they believed. But to understand why this place matters, truly matters, we must go beyond the architecture. We must go beyond the marble columns and the carved friezes, beyond the tourist photographs and the postcard images. We must travel back in time to a period when the world, as we know it, was still being invented. A period when the fundamental ideas that govern modern societies, democracy, philosophy, theater, science, and the rule of law, were not ancient concepts inherited from the past, but radical, dangerous, entirely new ideas being tested for the very first time by a small city-state on the edge of the Aegean Sea. Athens, in the 5th century before the Common Era, was a crucible, a place of extraordinary intellectual and cultural energy, where thinkers like Socrates walked the streets asking uncomfortable questions. Where playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides were inventing the art of dramatic storytelling, and where a statesman named Pericles stood before his people and declared that the greatest monument to Athenian greatness would not be found in its military victories, but in its buildings, in its art, in the stone and marble testimony of a civilization that believed beauty itself was a civic virtue. It was Pericles who commissioned the grand reconstruction of the Acropolis that we know today. In the aftermath of the Persian Wars, after the invading armies of Xerxes had burned the old temples to ground and left the sacred hill in ruins, Athens rose again. And under the vision of Pericles, guided by the genius of the sculptor Phidias and the architects Ictinus and Callicrates, the Acropolis was reborn as something the ancient world had never seen before. A complex of temples and monuments so perfectly proportioned, so mathematically precise, and so aesthetically breathtaking that architects and artists have been studying and imitating them for 25 centuries and still have not fully unlocked all of their secrets. At its center stands a Parthenon, the temple dedicated to Athena Parthenos, the virgin goddess and the divine protector of the city that bore her name. Even today, standing incomplete and partially in ruin, the Parthenon commands attention in a way that few structures on Earth can match. There is something in its proportions, in the gentle curve of its columns, in the mathematical refinements built invisibly into its design, that speaks directly to something deep in human perception. Ancient Greek architects understood that perfectly straight lines, when viewed from a distance, appear to sag and curve. And so they built deliberate, subtle curves into what appear to be straight surfaces, creating an optical illusion of absolute perfection. Every column on the Parthenon leans slightly inward. The floor curves upward gently at the center. The corner columns are slightly thicker than the rest. These are not accidents or imperfections. They are the calculated solutions of architectural minds working at the very highest level of their craft. Flanking the Parthenon on the sacred hill are other structures no less remarkable in their own right. The Erechtheion, with its famous porch of the Caryatids, 6 elegant female figures carved in marble serving as the columns of the porch itself, bearing the weight of the roof on their heads with an effortless grace that has astonished every generation that has ever looked upon them. The temple of Athena Nike, small but perfectly formed, perched at the southwestern edge of the hill like a sentinel guarding the entrance to the sacred precinct. And the Propylaea, the monumental gateway through which worshippers, pilgrims, and processions once passed on their way to pay tribute to the gods. Together, these structures form a complex that is, without exaggeration, one of the greatest achievements in the history of human civilization. not because they're the largest or the oldest or the most ornate. There are other monuments in the world that surpass the Acropolis on each of those individual measures. But because of what they represent, because of the ideas they embody, because of the civilization that produced them, and the extraordinary degree to which that civilization continues to shape the world we live in today, when you study the principles of democratic government, you are standing in the intellectual shadow of Athens. When you attend a theatrical performance, you are participating in an art form that was born in this city. When you engage in philosophical debate, when you stand for a court of law, when you speak of citizen rights and civic responsibility, you are, whether you know or not, speaking a language that was first articulated here, on this rocky hillside above the Aegean, more than 2,000 years ago. This is not merely a history of stones and columns. This is the history of an idea about what human beings are capable of, an idea about the kind of world that is possible when a civilization dares to ask the hardest questions, and then dares to build its answers in marble for all the world and all of time to see. Welcome to the Acropolis of Athens. Let us begin. Athens, Greece, a modern capital city of nearly 4 million people, situated on the southern tip of the Balkan Peninsula, where the land reaches down toward the warm blue waters of the Aegean Sea. It is a city of noise and traffic, of ancient neighborhoods and modern apartment buildings, of street cafes and open-air markets. It is in every sense a living, breathing, thoroughly contemporary metropolis. And yet, no matter where you stand in Athens, no matter how deep you are in a modern city, you can look up, and there it is, the Acropolis, rising above the urban sprawl like something from another world entirely. Its ancient temples catching the light of the Mediterranean sun, visible from nearly every corner of the city below. It is impossible to ignore and impossible to forget for the people of Athens. It is not a tourist attraction. It is not a museum piece. It is simply home, a constant, enduring presence that connects every generation of Athenians to every generation that came before them. The rock itself is a natural limestone outcropping, roughly 300 meters long and 150 meters wide, rising abruptly from the surrounding plain. In geological terms, it is what is known as a mesa, a flat-top elevation with steep, near-vertical sides. These natural defensive qualities made it an obvious site for human settlement long before the great temples were ever conceived. Archaeological evidence tells us that people have lived on or around the Acropolis since at least the 4th millennium before the Common Era. More than 6,000 years ago, in the Bronze Age, during the Mycenaean period, it served as a fortified palace complex, home to the rulers of a powerful early Greek kingdom. The massive walls built during this period, known as Cyclopean walls, so named because later Greeks believed only the mythical one-eyed giants called Cyclopes could have moved such enormous stones, can still be partially seen today, buried beneath the foundations of the classical structures built on top of them centuries later. But it is not the Bronze Age that defines the Acropolis. It is the classical period, specifically the remarkable half-century between approximately 461 and 406 BC. That transformed this ancient hilltop into the monument the world knows today. This was the age of Pericles, the golden age of Athenian democracy, a period of unprecedented cultural, intellectual, and artistic achievement that compressed more lasting human progress into a single generation than most civilizations manage across entire centuries. To understand why the Acropolis was built the way it was, and why it was built when it was, we need to understand the political and historical moment that produced it. Athens in the mid-5th century BC was riding a wave of extraordinary confidence. The city had, against all odds, played a decisive role in defeating 2 Persian invasions, first at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, and then again at the naval Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE. These were not merely military victories. They were civilization-defining moments that convinced the Athenians they were a people specially favored by the gods, a people with a unique destiny, a people whose way of life, democratic, open, intellectually curious, was worth defending and worth celebrating at the very highest level. It was in this atmosphere of confidence and civic pride that Pericles conceived his great building program. The old temples on the Acropolis had been destroyed by the Persians during their occupation of Athens in 480 BCE. For nearly 3 decades, the ruins have been left deliberately unrestored, a visible reminder of Persian aggression and Athenian sacrifice. But with the Persian threat finally neutralized and Athens now leading a powerful alliance of Greek city-states, Pericles argued that the time had come to rebuild, not merely to restore what had been lost, but to build something so magnificent, so far beyond anything that had existed before, that it would stand as an eternal testament to Athenian greatness. The result was one of the most ambitious construction projects in the ancient world, and it produced buildings that have never been surpassed. Long before Pericles, long before democracy, long before the name Athens had any meaning beyond a small cluster of settlements on a sun-baked plain in southeastern Greece, this hill was already sacred. The earliest inhabitants of the Acropolis were not builders of temples or philosophers of democracy. They were people of the Bronze Age, living in a world governed by warrior kings, oral traditions, and gods whose favor was the difference between survival and destruction. The Mycenaean Greeks who settled on the Acropolis around 1400 BC built a palace complex on the summit and surrounded it with those massive defensive walls that later generations would attribute to giants. This was a world of hierarchy and conflict, of raiding and trading across the Aegean, of myths and legends that would eventually find their way into the poems of Homer and the plays of the great Athenian dramatists. At the heart of Mycenaean religious life on the Acropolis was the worship of a goddess, a powerful female deity associated with wisdom, protection, and the arts of civilization. Scholars believe this early goddess cult was a direct ancestor of the worship of Athena that would come to define the classical city. The continuity is remarkable. Across nearly 1,000 years of social, political, and cultural transformation, from Bronze Age palace culture to the Greek Dark Ages, and into the brilliant light of the classical period, the sacred identity of this hill remained essentially unchanged. It was always the dwelling place of the divine protector of the city. The Greek Dark Ages, which followed the collapse of Mycenaean civilization around 1200 BCE, were a period of dramatic depopulation, loss of literacy, and cultural contraction across the entire eastern Mediterranean world. The palace on the Acropolis was abandoned. The great walls fell into disrepair. For several centuries, the hill that would one day be crowned with the Parthenon was largely quiet, a ghost of its former self, its Mycenaean glories fading into legend. But cities, like ideas, are remarkably difficult to extinguish entirely. By the 8th century BCE, Athens was recovering. The population of Attica, the surrounding region, was growing again. Trade was expanding. The Greek alphabet, adapted from Phoenician script, had been adopted and literacy was returning. And on the Acropolis, religious activity was intensifying once more. Temples were being built. Modest structures by later standards, constructed of wood and mud brick, but temples nonetheless. The sacred hill was reclaiming its identity. It was during this period of recovery and growth that the political structures of Athens began to take shape. The city was governed initially by kings, then by a council of aristocrats called the Areopagus, then by a series of powerful individuals known as tyrants, not in the modern negative sense, but simply as sole rulers who governed outside the traditional aristocratic framework. It was one such ruler, Pisistratos, who in the 6th century BCE first began investing seriously in the architectural development of the Acropolis, commissioning new temples and establishing the Great Panathenaic Festival, a citywide celebration in honor of Athena that would become the most important religious event in the Athenian calendar. The stage, in every sense, was being set. The ideas were forming. The city was finding itself. And high above it all, on that ancient limestone rock, the sacred hill waited, patient and enduring, for the moment when Athens would finally build a monument worthy of its greatest ambitions. That moment was almost here. To stand before the Parthenon for the first time is to experience something that very few buildings in the world are capable of producing, a sense of absolute, overwhelming rightness. Not grandeur in the way that sheer size produces grandeur, not spectacle in the way that ornamentation produces spectacle, but something quieter, deeper, and far more difficult to achieve. A sense that every proportion, every angle, every relationship between one element and another is precisely, inevitably correct, that nothing could be added and nothing could be removed without diminishing the whole. This is not an accident. It is a result of one of the most sophisticated architectural minds in human history, working at the absolute peak of its abilities. in service of a civilization that considered beauty not a luxury, but moral obligation. The Parthenon was designed by two architects, Ictinus and Callicrates, under the artistic supervision of the sculptor Phidias, who served as the overall director of Pericles' building program. Construction began in 447 BCE and was largely completed by 432 BC, a remarkably short period of 15 years for a building of such complexity and ambition. It is constructed almost entirely of pentelic marble, quarried from Mount Pentelicus, approximately 16 kilometers northeast of Athens. The marble of Pentelicus contains traces of iron that, upon exposure to the atmosphere over centuries, oxidize and give the stone its distinctive warm, honey gold color, a color that deepens and enriches with age, so that the Parthenon today, though ruined, glows in the Athenian sunlight with a warmth that new marble could never replicate. The building sits on a three-step platform called a stylobate and is surrounded by a colonnade of 46 outer columns, 8 across each end and 17 along each side. Each column stands approximately 10 meters tall and follows the Doric order, the oldest and most austere of the three classical Greek architectural orders, characterized by its simplicity of form, its lack of a base, and its plain, cushion-like capital at the top. But to call the Parthenon's columns simple would be deeply misleading, because within that apparent simplicity lies a degree of mathematical refinement that borders on the obsessive. Every column on the Parthenon is not a perfect cylinder. Each one swells slightly in the middle, a deliberate technique known as enthesis, before tapering again toward the top. This subtle swelling counteracts the optical illusion by which perfectly straight columns appear to narrow and weaken at their center when viewed from a distance. The corner columns are also very slightly thicker than the interior columns, compensating for the fact that corner columns, seen against the open sky rather than against the dark interior of the building, appear thinner than they actually are, and every column leans very slightly inward, so slightly that if their central axes were extended upward, they would meet at a theoretical point approximately 2 kilometers above the building. The floor of the Parthenon curves upward, rising approximately 6 centimeters at the center of each long side and approximately 4 centimeters at each end. The horizontal entablature, the band of stonework running above the columns, follows the same curve. Even the walls of the inner chamber lean slightly inward. The result of all these accumulated refinements is a building that appears, to the human eye, to be composed entirely of straight lines and perfect right angles, when in fact there is not a single perfectly straight horizontal line or perfect right angle anywhere in the entire structure. The sculptural program of the Parthenon was no less extraordinary than its architecture. The building was adorned with 3 distinct programs of sculpture: the metopes, the frieze, and the pediments, each of which represented a masterpiece of classical Greek art in its own right. The 92 metopes depicted mythological battle scenes. The continuous frieze that ran around the interior of the colonnade, 160 meters long, depicted the Parthenon procession, the great festival parade of Athenian citizens making their way up to the Acropolis to present a new robe to the goddess. And the 2 great pediments at either end of the building depicted, respectively, the birth of Athena from the head of Zeus and the contest between Athena and Poseidon for dominion over Athens. At the center of it all, housed within the inner chamber of the temple, stood the crowning achievement of Phidias, the chrysophanon statue of Athena Parthenos. 12 meters tall, constructed of ivory and gold over a wooden frame, it depicted the goddess standing fully armed, her shield resting at her side, a small figure of Nike, the goddess of victory, held in her outstretched right hand. It was, by all ancient accounts, one of the most spectacular works of art the ancient world had ever produced. The statue no longer exists. It was removed in late antiquity, and its ultimate fate remains unknown. But ancient descriptions and later copies give us some sense of its overwhelming presence within the temple's interior. The Parthenon was not built in isolation. It was a centerpiece of an entire civilization operating at the height of its creative and intellectual powers. And to understand the building fully, we must understand the world that produced it. The Athens of Pericles was, by the standards of the ancient world, something genuinely unprecedented. It was a democracy, not a perfect democracy by modern standards, and certainly not a universal one, for women, slaves, and foreign residents were all excluded from political participation. But for the free male citizens of Athens, It was a system of genuine collective self-governance, more ambitious and more participatory than anything that had existed before. The Athenian assembly met regularly on the Hill of the Knicks, within sight of the Acropolis, and every citizen had the right to speak and to vote on the decisions that governed the city. Decisions about war and peace, about public finances, about the laws under which Athenians lived. All of these were made not by a king, not by an aristocracy, but by the citizens themselves. This political system was inseparable from the cultural explosion that surrounded it. Democracy, as the Athenians practiced it, required an educated, engaged, and articulate citizenry. It required the ability to reason, to argue, to persuade. And so it created a demand for education, for philosophy, rhetoric, and logic that produced some of the greatest thinkers in human history. Socrates, who was born around 470 BCE and spent his life walking the streets of Athens, engaging citizens in philosophical dialogue, argued that the unexamined life was not worth living, and that wisdom began with the honest acknowledgement of one's own ignorance. His student Plato founded the Academy, widely considered the world's first institution of higher learning, and wrote the philosophical dialogues that would form the foundation of Western philosophy for the next 2.5 millennia. And Plato's student Aristotle systematized human knowledge across virtually every field of inquiry, from biology and physics to ethics, politics, and aesthetics, creating intellectual frameworks that dominated Western thought well into the modern era. At the same time, the theater, born in Athens in the religious festivals held in honor of the god Dionysus, was reaching its classical peak. The playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were producing tragedies of such psychological depth and dramatic power that they continue to be performed on stages around the world today. Aristophanes was inventing political comedy. The great historian Thucydides was writing his account of the Peloponnesian War with a commitment to evidence and analysis that established the foundations of historical writing as a discipline. This was the civilization that built the Acropolis, and the Acropolis, in turn, was a physical embodiment of everything that civilization believed about itself. Its relationship with the gods, its pride in its own achievements, and its conviction that beauty, truth, and civic virtue were not separate ideals, but expressions of a single, unified vision of human excellence. Every great civilization carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. Athens was no exception. The very empire that funded the construction of the Parthenon, the Delian League, a network of allied Greek city-states nominally united against the Persian threat, but increasingly dominated and exploited by Athens, generated resentments that would ultimately destroy Athenian supremacy. Sparta, Athens' great rival on the Greek mainland, viewed the growing power of Athens with deepening alarm. And in 431 BCE, just 1 year after the Parthenon sculptural program was completed, the two most powerful city-states in the Greek world went to war. The Peloponnesian War lasted 27 catastrophic years. It was a conflict of extraordinary brutality and complexity, fought across the entire Greek world and beyond, and it ended in 404 BCE with complete military defeat of Athens. The long walls connecting the city to its harbor were torn down. The Athenian navy was dismantled. A Spartan-backed oligarchy replaced the democratic government. The golden age was over. Athens recovered, partially. Democracy was restored. Intellectual and cultural life continued. But the city never again reached the political and military heights of the Periclean era. The 4th century BCE brought new challenges. The rise of Macedon under Philip II, and then the conquest of his son Alexander Great, which spread Greek culture across an enormous arc of territory from Egypt to the borders of India, but simultaneously diminished the independent power of the city-states that had been its original home. Then came Rome. By the 2nd century BCE, Greece had become a Roman province, and Athens, though treated with considerable respect by Roman rulers who admired its cultural legacy, was now a subject city rather than a sovereign one. The Acropolis continued to function as a religious site, and Roman emperors added their own monuments and dedications to the sacred hill. But the living civilization that had built the Parthenon was gone, absorbed into an empire that spanned 3 continents. The centuries that followed brought wave after wave of transformation. The Parthenon was converted into a Christian church in the 5th century CE, dedicated first to the Virgin Mary. The great cult statue of Athena was removed, the interior was altered, and an apse was added to the eastern end. Then, Following the Ottoman conquest of Athens in 1458, the church became a mosque and a minaret was added to the structure. For nearly 1,000 years, the Temple of Athena served faiths its builders could never have imagined. The most catastrophic single moment in the post-classical history of the Acropolis came in 1687, during a war between the Ottoman Empire and the Venetian Republic. Venetian forces besieging Athens fired artillery at the Acropolis, where Ottoman defenders had stored a large quantity of gunpowder inside the Parthenon. The resulting explosion blew out the entire interior of the building, destroyed the central columns of both long sides, and left the structure in the ruined state in which we find it today. In a single night, more damage was done to the Parthenon than in all the preceding 21 centuries of its existence. What survived was extraordinary only because what had existed before was so exceptional, and what survived still commands a hilltop above Athens, broken but undefeated. For most of human history, the Acropolis was not a site of scholarly investigation. It was a living place, a religious sanctuary, a military fortress, a political symbol, continuously occupied, continuously altered, and continuously reinterpreted by each successive civilization that claimed it. The idea of treating it as an archaeological site, of carefully excavating its layers and systematically studying what lay beneath the surface, is a relatively modern concept. And when that systematic study finally began in earnest in the 19th century, what emerged from the soil and rubble of the sacred hill was nothing short of astonishing. The formal archaeological investigation of the Acropolis began in the decades following Greek independence from Ottoman rule, which was achieved in 1821 after nearly 4 centuries of occupation. The new Greek state, acutely conscious of the symbolic importance of its ancient monuments to its national identity and international standing, moved quickly to clear the Acropolis of the medieval and Ottoman structures that had accumulated over the centuries. The mosque that had occupied the Parthenon was demolished. The minaret was removed. The remains of the medieval towers and fortifications that had been added to the ancient walls were taken down. And as this clearing work proceeded, archaeologists began to realize that the ground beneath their feet contained secrets that had been sealed away since antiquity. The most dramatic of these early discoveries came in 1886, during excavations on the northern slope of the Acropolis, when archaeologists uncovered what became known as the Persian, a German word meaning, roughly, the Persian rubble. This was a massive deposit of material that had been deliberately buried by the Athenians in the years following the Persian sack of 480 BC. When the Persians destroyed the old temples and sanctuaries on the Acropolis, they left behind a landscape of broken statues, shattered votive offerings, and architectural fragments. When the Athenians returned to their city and began rebuilding, they did not simply discard this debris. Instead, they gathered it up with extraordinary care and buried it within the Acropolis itself, using it partly as fill material for new construction, but treating it, in essence, as sacred, too holy to be thrown away, too damaged to be displayed, and therefore committed to the earth of the sacred hill itself for safekeeping. What this meant for archaeologists 2.5 millennia later was the discovery of an almost perfectly preserved time capsule of pre-classical Athenian art. Among the most spectacular finds from the Persian were the Caryatids, a series of marble statues of young women that had originally stood as votive offerings on the Acropolis. These figures, carved in the archaic style that preceded the classical period, display a fascinating transitional aesthetic, still formal and frontal in their posture, still wearing the characteristic archaic smile that seems so enigmatic to modern eyes, but already beginning to show the movement toward naturalism and lifelike representation that would culminate in the supreme masterpieces of the classical era. Today, these figures are housed in the Acropolis Museum, where they stand in a long, luminous gallery, their original painted surfaces largely worn away, but their forms still radiating a serene and timeless beauty. The excavations of the late 19th and early 20th centuries also shed critical new light on the history of the Acropolis before the classical period. Evidence of Mycenaean habitation was uncovered, fragment of pottery, the remains of the Great Bronze Age walls, traces of the palace complex that had once crowned the hill. These discoveries confirmed what scholars had long suspected from the literary sources, that the sacred history of the Acropolis extended back far beyond the classical period, deep into the prehistoric past of the Greek world. In more recent decades, the application of modern scientific techniques has opened entirely new dimensions of understanding. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed previously unknown features beneath the surface of the hill. Isotopic analysis of the pentelic marble used in the classical buildings has allowed researchers to track the precise quarrying and transportation of individual blocks with extraordinary precision. Three-dimensional laser scanning has produced digital models of the surviving structures so detailed that every crack, every tool mark, and every ancient repair is captured with millimeter accuracy, creating a permanent record of the monuments as they exist today and providing an invaluable baseline for monitoring future deterioration. Perhaps the most consequential ongoing discovery, however, is not a physical object, but a growing understanding. Over recent decades, careful study of the surviving sculptural fragments from the Acropolis, many of them scattered across museums in Athens, London, Paris, Copenhagen, and elsewhere, has revealed that the classical Greek temples were not the pure, gleaming white structures they appear to be today. They were painted, vividly, even brilliantly painted, in deep reds, blues, and yellows, with gilded details that caught the Mediterranean sunlight and transformed the Acropolis into something far more visually exuberant than the austere marble monuments we see today. The whiteness of classical Greek architecture, so deeply embedded in our cultural imagination, is in fact the whiteness of time, of 2,500 years of weathering that has stripped away every trace of the original color. The Acropolis that Pericles built was not a study in restraint. It was a blaze of color against the blue Athenian sky. This revelation has fundamentally altered our understanding not only of the Acropolis but of classical antiquity as a whole. It reminds us, with humbling force, how much of the ancient world we have lost, and how carefully we must hold our assumptions about a civilization we know in reality only through fragments and shadows. There's a thought experiment worth pausing on. Imagine, for a moment, that Athens had lost the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. Imagine that the Persian fleet had destroyed the Greek naval forces in the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the Attic coastline, that Athens had fallen permanently under Persian dominion, that the democratic experiment had been extinguished in its infancy, and that the cultural explosion of the 5th century BC had never occurred. What would the world look like today? It is, of course, impossible to answer with certainty. History does not offer controlled experiments, but the question forces us to confront, directly and concretely, just how much of the modern world traces its origins to the civilization that built the Acropolis. The debt is not metaphorical. It is structural, embedded in the deepest foundations of Western and increasingly global culture. Begin with politics. The concept of democracy, of government derived from the consent of the governed, of citizens participating directly in the decisions that shape their collective lives, was not discovered by the modern world. It was invented in Athens in the late 6th century BCE, refined and expanded to the 5th century, and transmitted to the modern world through the writings of Greek historians, philosophers, and political theorists whose work survived the collapse of the ancient world and were rediscovered during the Renaissance. The American founding fathers read Thucydides and Aristotle. The architects of the French Revolution drew on classical models of civic virtue. Every modern democracy, however different from the Athenian original, stands in a direct line of intellectual descent from political experiment conducted in the city that built the Parthenon. Then there is philosophy, the Western philosophical tradition, the tradition that gave us logic and epistemology, ethics and metaphysics. The philosophy of mind and the philosophy of science begins in its formal systematic expression with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. These three thinkers, all of them Athenians or residents of Athens during the classical period, established the questions, the methods, and the vocabulary that philosophers have been working with ever since. When René Descartes sat down in his heated room in the 17th century and asked what he could know with certainty, he was asking a question that Socrates had asked 2,000 years earlier on the streets of Athens. When modern ethicists debate the foundations of moral judgment, they are working within a framework whose basic architecture was laid by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. The arts, too, bear the unmistakable imprint of the Athenian achievement. The theater, both tragedy and comedy, was invented in Athens as part of the religious festivals of Dionysus, and the dramatic structures, character types, and thematic concerns developed by Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes have never ceased to influence storytellers and dramatists. Shakespeare drew on Greek dramatic traditions. Modern cinema, with its three-act structure and its exploration of fate, hubris, and the consequences of human choice, is in many ways a direct descendant of the Athenian stage. And then there is architecture itself. The influence of classical Greek architecture on the built environment of the modern world is so pervasive that we have largely ceased to notice it. The columns, pediments, and proportional systems developed on the Acropolis became the foundational vocabulary of Western architecture, transmitted through Rome, revived during the Renaissance, and deployed with remarkable persistence across the following 5 centuries. The facade of government buildings, banks, museums, universities, and courts of law across Europe and North America speak, in stone and marble and concrete, a language that was first spoken on a rocky hilltop above the Aegean Sea more than 2,500 years ago. The Acropolis, then, is not simply a monument to a vanished civilization. It is the origin point of an extraordinary river of ideas, art, and institutions that flows, still powerful and still living, to the heart of the modern world. To stand on the sacred hill and look out over Athens, the modern city spreading in every direction to horizon, with its millions of inhabitants living their daily lives within legal, political, and cultural frameworks that Athens helped to create, is to experience, with rare and vivid directness, the reality of historical continuity. The past is not behind us. It is beneath us, above us, and all around us. And nowhere on earth is that truth more powerfully felt than here, on the Acropolis of Athens. There is a particular quality to the light in Athens in the early morning hours, before the heat of the day has fully established itself, and before the city has completely shaken off the quiet of the night. It is a light that is simultaneously soft and sharp, softened by the thin morning haze that rises from the Saronic Gulf to the south, but sharp in a way that Mediterranean light is always sharp, cutting clean edges on every surface it touches, throwing the contours of stone and marble into a clarity that feels almost unnaturally precise. It is the kind of light that makes you understand, immediately and instinctively, why the ancient Greeks were so preoccupied with form. In light like this, form is everything. Shadow and surface, angle and curve, these are not aesthetic abstractions. They are the fundamental language through which the physical world communicates with the human eye. It is in this light, in the early morning hours, that the Acropolis is best experienced. The hill opens to visitors at 8 o'clock in the morning, and the single most important piece of practical advice that could be offered to anyone planning a visit is this: arrive at the moment the gates open, or as close to it as humanly possible. By mid-morning, particularly during the peak summer months of June, July, and August, the Acropolis receives thousands of visitors per day. In the busiest periods, estimates suggest that up to 20,000 people may pass through the site on a single day. The pathways become crowded. The viewing areas around the Parthenon fill with tour groups. The particular quality of contemplative silence that the sacred hill seems to demand becomes increasingly difficult to find. But in those first hours after opening, when the crowds have not yet gathered and the light is still finding its angle, the Acropolis can feel, briefly and preciously, as though it belongs entirely to you. The approach to the summit begins at the base of the hill, where visitors gather at the main ticket office near the southern slope. From here, the path winds upward through a landscape of wild thyme and prickly pear, past the ancient theater of Dionysus, the birthplace of Western drama, cut into the southern slope of the hill and still, in its ruined state, possessed of a haunting theatrical presence, and past the later Odeon of Herod's Atticus, a well-preserved Roman theater from the 2nd century CE that continues to host performances of music and drama to this day, its ancient stone seating filled on summer evenings, with audiences watching concerts against the incomparable backdrop of the illuminated Acropolis above. As the path steepens and the summit approaches, the first dramatic encounter with the ancient monuments comes at the Propylaea, the monumental gateway that serves as a formal entrance to the sacred precinct. The Propylaea was designed by the architect Nesicles and constructed between 437 and 432 BCE, overlapping with the final years of work on the Parthenon itself. It is a structure of considerable complexity and ambition, designed to create a carefully orchestrated experience of transition, a physical and psychological threshold between the ordinary world of the city below and the sacred world of the hilltop above. Passing through the central hall of the Propylaea, between the tall Doric columns that frame the passage, is one of those rare architectural experiences that fully justifies the word sublime. The columns rise on either side. The marble floor, worn smooth by millions of feet across 2.5 millennia, catches a morning light, And then, as you emerge in the shadow of the gateway onto the open plateau of the summit, the Parthenon appears before you in its full, overwhelming presence. No photograph prepares you for this moment. No description fully captures it. The Parthenon is, even in its ruined state, perhaps especially in its ruined state, with its broken roof open to the sky and its interior colonnade exposed, a building of staggering visual authority. There is a weight to it that goes beyond its physical mass, a presence that seems to reach beyond the purely architectural into something more difficult to name. Ancient writers described experiencing the presence of the divine in this place, and while that may be a category of experience unavailable to many modern visitors, what remains is something no less profound, a direct, physical encounter with the full depth of human time, and with the extraordinary capacity of human beings to create objects of enduring beauty. The restoration and preservation work that has been ongoing on the Acropolis since the 1970s is visible throughout the site, and it deserves more than passing attention. Under the direction of the Committee for Conservation of the Acropolis Monuments, a team of architects, archaeologists, engineers, and conservators has been engaged for more than 4 decades in one of the most complex and painstaking restoration projects in the history of cultural heritage preservation. The work is guided by a strict philosophical principle: reversibility. Every intervention must be capable of being undone by future generations with better knowledge and better tools. No permanent damage to original material is permissible. Where new marble must be inserted to stabilize a structure, it is cut from the same pentelic quarries that supplied the original builders, but marked discreetly so that it can always be distinguished from ancient material. The results of this work are visible most dramatically in the Parthenon itself, where fallen columns have been re-erected using a combination of ancient drums recovered from the rubble and new marble inserts. The process of re-erection requires solving engineering problems of extraordinary delicacy. The original ancient Greeks used iron clamps coated in lead to join the drums of their columns, and it was the rusting and expansion of these iron clamps over the centuries that caused much of the damage to the surviving structure. The modern restoration uses titanium clamps instead, a material that will not rust, will not expand, and will not cause future damage to the marble it holds. To the northeast of the Parthenon stands the Erechtheion, and if the Parthenon commands through authority and scale, the Erechtheion enchants through intimacy and elegance. It is an asymmetrical building, unusual for classical Greek architecture, built on an irregular plan necessitated by the uneven terrain of the site and by the requirement to incorporate several existing sacred spots, including the legendary location where Athena's olive tree first sprouted and the mark left in the bedrock by Poseidon's trident during their divine contest for city. The building's northern porch, with its tall and graceful Ionic columns, is one of the most beautiful architectural compositions on the Acropolis. But it is the southern porch, the porch of the Caryatids, that draws the eye and the imagination most powerfully. The 6 Caryatids that support the roof of the southern porch are among the most celebrated sculptures in the world, and to stand before them is to feel, with unusual directness, the gulf between ancient artistry and any easy description of it. These are not decorative figures. They are structural elements. They bear real weight, real architectural load, and yet they bear it with an ease and a grace that makes the stone seem momentarily to breathe. Their drapery falls in deep, precise folds. Their weight shifts subtly from one leg to the other in the contrapposto pose that Greek sculptors were just beginning to explore in the late 5th century BC. Their faces, serene, self-possessed, gazing out over the city they watched for 2,500 years, carry an expression that resists easy interpretation. They are not sad. They are not joyful. They are simply present, with a completeness and a stillness that no merely human emotion can quite account for. It should be noted that the figures currently standing on the porch of the Caryatids are high-quality replicas. 5 of the 6 original Caryatids were removed from the site in the late 19th century and are now housed in the Acropolis Museum, where the controlled environment protects them from the air pollution and acid rain that have been causing accelerating surface erosion. The 6th original Caryatid was removed by the British diplomat Lord Elgin in the early 19th century and is currently held in the British Museum in London, a circumstance that has been a source of sustained diplomatic tension between Greece and the United Kingdom for well over a century, and one that we will address in greater detail shortly. At the southwestern corner of the Acropolis, perched at the very edge of the hill on a small projecting bastion, stands the delicate temple of Athena Nike. The temple dedicated to Athena as the goddess of victory. It is the smallest of the major structures on the Acropolis, but in its proportions and its setting, it is perhaps the most immediately beautiful. Designed by the architect Callicrates, one of the two architects of the Parthenon, and completed around 420 BCE. It follows the Ionic order, with four slender columns at each end and a continuous sculptural frieze running around all four sides. The frieze depicted scenes of battles, both mythological and historical, celebrating Athenian military victories. The location of the temple, at the edge of the precipice overlooking the main approach to the Acropolis, made it the first sacred structure that ancient visitors would see as they climbed the hill, and its position, high above surrounding landscape, gleaming white against the sky, announced the sacred character of the precinct with unmistakable visual clarity. The Acropolis Museum, opened in 2009 at the base of the hill, represents the final essential element of any serious engagement with the site. Designed by the Swiss-American architect Bernard Tschumi, it is a building of considerable architectural distinction in its own right. Glass-floored galleries through which visitors can see ongoing archaeological excavations below, a top-floor gallery aligned precisely with the orientation of the Parthenon itself and flooded with natural light, displaying the surviving sections of the Parthenon frieze in their original sequence. The museum is, among other things, a carefully constructed argument, a demonstration that Athens possesses a world-class facility fully capable of housing and displaying the Parthenon sculptures in their proper context, and that the reunification of the scattered fragment of the monument is not merely a sentimental aspiration, but a scholarly and cultural imperative. To visit the Acropolis today is to participate in a conversation that has been going on for 2,500 years. Every generation that has climbed this hill has brought its own questions, its own needs, its own understanding of what the monuments mean and why they matter. The ancient Athenians came to worship. The Romans came to admire. The Byzantines came to pray in a different faith. The Ottomans came to occupy and govern. The Romantics came to mourn. The modern visitor comes, perhaps, with a more complex mixture of motivations, curiosity and reverence, aesthetic pleasure and historical inquiry, the desire to touch, however briefly, something that has outlasted every civilization that has ever tried to claim it. The hill endures, the marble weathers, and the restoration continues. And the conversation goes on. There is a question that hovers, unspoken but persistent, over every serious engagement with the Acropolis. It is a question that becomes more insistent the longer you stand on the sacred hill, the more deeply you absorb its history, the more fully you reckon with the extraordinary arc of human ambition and human fragility that this place embodies. The question is this: what does it mean to build something intended to last forever in a world where nothing lasts forever? The ancient Athenians were not naive about mortality. Their literature is saturated with an acute, unflinching awareness of the transience of human life and human achievement. Homer's heroes weep for the brevity of existence. The tragedians built their greatest dramas around the theme of hubris, of human beings overreaching the limits that fate and the gods have set for them, and being destroyed by their own excessive ambition. The philosopher Heraclitus, roughly contemporary with the great building program of Pericles, articulated what may be the most impressed and most enduring statement of the Greek understanding of impermanence. Everything flows. Nothing stands still. You cannot step into the same river twice. And yet they built the Parthenon. They quarried 16,000 tons of marble from a mountain 16 kilometers away, transported it across difficult terrain, cut it and dressed it and fitted it together with precision measured in fractions of a millimeter, carved 10,000 square meters of sculptural decoration, and housed within a statue their goddess sheathed in ivory and gold. They did all of this with a full understanding that civilizations rise and fall, that wars are lost as well as won, that the gods themselves, as their own mythology made abundantly clear, were not permanent fixtures, but dynamic, contentious, and occasionally capricious beings whose favor could not be taken for granted. What this tells us, if we are paying attention, is something profound about the nature of human making. The Athenians did not build the Parthenon because they believed it would literally last forever. They built it because the act of building it, the aspiration embodied, the collective commitment it required, the beauty it achieved, was itself a form of meaning. They built it because a civilization that does not reach beyond its immediate needs, that does not invest in beauty and permanence and the expression of its highest values in durable form, is a civilization that has already begun to diminish. They built it in the deepest sense, not for the gods and not for posterity, but for themselves, as an act of self-definition, a declaration of what they believed human beings were capable of at their best. That declaration has echoed down through 25 centuries, and it has not lost its power. Consider the Elgin Marbles, perhaps the most consequential and most contentious cultural heritage dispute in the modern world, and one that brings a question of what these monuments mean and who they belong to into sharp and unavoidable focus. Between 1801 and 1812, Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin and British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, removed approximately half of the surviving sculptural decoration of the Parthenon, sections of the frieze, several of the metopes, and figures from both pediments, and shipped them to England, where they were eventually acquired by the British Museum, where they remain today. Elgin claimed, and his defenders have continued to claim, that he acted with the permission of the Ottoman authorities, and that his actions saved the sculptures from further damage and deterioration. His critics, and they are numerous, and they include the Greek government, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and a substantial body of international scholarly and legal opinion, argue that the removal was an act of cultural spoliation, that the Ottoman authorities had no legitimate right to authorize the removal of monuments belonging to the Greek people, and that the sculptures should be returned to Athens, where they can be reunited with the surviving portions still on the Acropolis and displayed in their proper historical and cultural context. The argument made by the British Museum for retaining the sculptures rests on several pillars. The museum contends that it serves as a universal museum, holding the cultural heritage of humanity in trust for all people regardless of nationality, and that displaying the sculptures in London makes them accessible to a global audience that would not otherwise be able to see them. It argues that the sculptures have been in London for over 2 centuries, and that British law prohibits the deaccessioning of objects from a museum's collection. And it suggests, with varying degrees of explicitness, that the safety and scholarly care provided by the museum represent a form of stewardship that cannot be guaranteed elsewhere. The Greek response to each of these arguments is patient, methodical, and, to many observers, compelling. The Acropolis Museum, opened in 2009 specifically to address the question of where the sculptures could best be displayed, is one of the finest museum facilities in the world, climate-controlled, seismically engineered, staffed by world-class conservators, and designed with top-floor gallery, whose dimensions and orientation correspond precisely to those of the Parthenon itself, so that the surviving sculptures can be displayed in their original sequence and in their proper relationship to one another and to the building they once adorned. The argument that London provides superior care for sculptures has been rendered effectively obsolete by the existence of this facility. The deeper argument, that a universal museum serves humanity better than a national museum, raises questions that go well beyond the specific case of the Parthenon sculptures. It touches on fundamental issues of cultural identity, of the relationship between objects and the communities from which they originate, of the obligations that powerful institutions bear toward the peoples whose heritage they hold. These are not questions with simple answers, but they are questions that the Acropolis, more than almost any other site on Earth, forces us to confront with full seriousness. What is clear is this: the Parthenon frieze, as it currently exists, is a broken thing. Approximately half of the surviving sections are in Athens, displayed in the Acropolis Museum. The other half are in London, in the British Museum. Several additional fragments are scattered across other European museums. The building to which they all belong stands on a hill in Athens, incomplete and partially in ruins, but still standing, still the centerpiece of a living city, still the most powerful symbol of a civilization whose ideas continue to shape the modern world. The question of where the sculptures belong is, at its heart, a question about what kind of relationship we want to have with the past, whether we see cultural heritage as a resource to be distributed and managed by the institutions powerful enough to acquire it, or as a living connection between objects, places, and the communities of people whose identity those objects help to constitute. It is a question that the Acropolis itself seems to answer simply by existing, beyond the specific controversy of the Elgin Marbles. The broader question of how we relate to the Acropolis in the 21st century is one that deserves sustained and honest reflection. The site receives millions of visitors per year, and the cumulative physical impact of that visitation, the vibration of millions of footsteps on ancient marble, the moisture and carbon dioxide exhaled by crowds of tourists, The mechanical stress imposed by the constant movement of large numbers of people through a fragile archaeological site is a genuine and ongoing threat to the preservation of the monuments. The Greek government and the international archaeological community have spent decades wrestling with the tension between the democratic imperative of making these monuments accessible to all people and the conservation imperative of protecting them from the damage that accessibility inevitably causes. There are no easy solutions. Restricting access to the Acropolis would be deeply unpopular and arguably contrary to the democratic spirit of the civilization that created it. But allowing unlimited access threatens the long-term survival of the very monuments that visitors come to see. The ongoing restoration program, the construction of the Acropolis Museum, the installation of protective surfaces over the most vulnerable areas of ancient marble, these are all partial responses to an inherently difficult problem, responses that by time and slow deterioration, but cannot ultimately reverse the fundamental vulnerability of 2,500-year-old marble to the combined pressures of atmospheric pollution, acid rain, thermal expansion, and the sheer weight of human attention. What the conservators and archaeologists working on the Acropolis understand, with a clarity born of daily encounter with the physical reality of the monuments, is that preservation is not a state, but a process. It is not something that can be achieved and then maintained passively. It requires constant attention, constant intervention, constant negotiation between competing demands of scholarship, public access, national identity, international obligation, and the simple, irreducible physical fragility of ancient stone. It requires, in other words, exactly the kind of sustained collective commitment that the Athenians themselves brought to the creation of these monuments. The understanding that the most important things are never finished, never fully secured, never beyond a need for ongoing care and renewal. There is something deeply appropriate about this. The Acropolis was not built as a monument to a completed achievement. It was built as an expression of an ongoing aspiration. The aspiration toward beauty, toward excellence, toward a form of human life worthy of the gods who were believed to watch over it. The fact that it requires ongoing human effort to preserve it, that each generation must make its own commitment to its survival, is not a sign of fragility. It is a sign of life. Dead things require no maintenance. It is only living things, living ideas, living connections between the past and the present that demand the constant, loving attention of the people who care about their survival. And people do care, deeply, passionately, across every national boundary and cultural difference. The Acropolis receives visitors from every country on Earth. It has been studied by scholars from every academic tradition. It has inspired artists, architects, poets, philosophers, and political thinkers on every continent. It appears in the constitutions of democracies, in the curricula of universities, in the design vocabulary of public buildings from Washington to Tokyo to Nairobi. It is, in the fullest and most literal sense, a monument that belongs to all of humanity. Not because any institution has declared it so, but because the ideas it embodies, the questions it raises, and the beauty achieved speak to something that is not Greek or European or Western, but simply irreducibly human. The aspiration towards self-governance. The belief that beauty is not a luxury, but a necessity. The conviction that the examined life, the life lived in honest confrontation with the hardest questions, is more worthy of a human being than the unexamined life. The understanding that civilization is not a destination but a practice, something that must be actively maintained, actively renewed, actively chosen by each generation in full awareness of what the alternative looks like. These are not ancient ideas. They are permanent ones. And they are as urgently relevant in the 21st century as they were in the 5th century BCE, when a small city-state on the edge of the Aegean Sea decided to build on a flat-topped limestone rock above its streets, the most beautiful complex of buildings the world had ever seen, and in doing so, declare to all time what human beings are capable when they are truly and fully at their best. The Acropolis endures. The marble weathers. The restoration continues. The conversation goes on. And somewhere in Athens, in the early morning light, before the heat of the day and before the crowds have gathered, the hill stands quiet above the city, ancient, patient, and still, after all these centuries, absolutely alive. For all that we know about the Acropolis, and we know a great deal, the product of nearly 2 centuries of systematic archaeological investigation, architectural analysis, and historical scholarship, there remains a substantial and fascinating body of questions that have not been answered. Some of these are questions of fact, where the evidence is simply insufficient to support a definitive conclusion. Others are questions of interpretation, where the evidence exists, but scholars disagree about what it means. And others still are questions of more philosophical character, questions about meaning, intention, and the inner life of a civilization that left us its buildings and its texts, but not, ultimately, its full experience of itself. Together, these unsolved mysteries and unresolved controversies give the Acropolis a depth and an intellectual vitality that purely known and fully explained monuments cannot possess. They remind us that the past is not a closed book, but an ongoing conversation, one in which new voices and new evidence continue to change our understanding in ways that no previous generation could have anticipated. Begin with the question that has fascinated and frustrated scholars for generations. What precisely did the Parthenon mean to the ancient Athenians? On one level, the answer seems obvious. It was a temple, a house of the goddess Athena, the divine protector of the city. It contained her great cult statue. It was the centerpiece of the religious life of the city and the focal point of the Panathenaic festival that celebrated Athena's relationship with her people every 4 years with particular splendor. These facts are well established and not seriously disputed. But beneath the surface clarity lie layers of complexity and ambiguity that become more pronounced the more closely they are examined. Was the Parthenon actually used as a conventional temple in the way that other Greek religious buildings were used? The evidence suggests it may not have been. Unlike most Greek temples, the Parthenon appears to have had no altar directly in front of it. The altar of Athena on the Acropolis was located not before the Parthenon, but before the older Erechtheion to the north. If sacrifices and the primary rituals of Athena worship were conducted at a different altar, what exactly was the Parthenon for? Was it primarily a treasury, a glorified storehouse for the wealth of the Athenian Empire, the gold and silver of the Delian League's tribute, housed in the great goddess's temple as a form of sacred protection? Was it primarily a political monument, a declaration of Athenian power and cultural supremacy directed as much at the city's Greek rivals as at its gods? Was it, as some scholars have argued, primarily a work of art, a building whose purpose was less functional than aesthetic and ideological, existing to be seen and admired rather than to serve a specific ritual function? The honest answer is that it was probably all these things simultaneously, and that the ancient Athenians would not have recognized the distinctions we are drawing between them. In the classical Athenian worldview, the religious, the political, the aesthetic, and the civic were not separate categories, but aspects of a single unified vision of the good life and the good city. The Parthenon was sacred and political and beautiful and functional all at once, and any attempt to reduce it to a single purpose misunderstands the civilization that created it. But the precise weighting of these different dimensions, the relative importance of the religious versus the political versus the aesthetic in the minds of Pericles and Phidias and the Athenian assembly that voted to fund the construction, remains genuinely uncertain, and the debate continues to generate some of the most interesting scholarship in the field of classical studies. Then there is the mystery of the Parthenon frieze, the continuous band of sculptural relief 160 meters long that ran around the interior of the colonnade, depicting what appears to be a procession of Athenian citizens. The identification of this procession as the Panathenaic procession, the great festival parade that carried a new robe to the goddess every 4 years, is the dominant interpretation and is supported by considerable evidence, but it has not gone unchallenged. A minority scholarly view, associated most prominently with the classicist Joan Brennan Connolly, argues that the frieze does not depict a historical or recurring civic ritual at all, but rather a specific mythological event, the sacrifice of the daughters of the legendary Athenian king Erechtheion, offered to the gods to secure victory for Athens in a primordial war. This interpretation, if correct, would transform our understanding of the frieze's meaning entirely, from a celebration of Athenian civic life to a meditation on sacrifice, duty, and the terrible price that the city's survival has sometimes demanded of its people. The debate between these two interpretations has been conducted at the highest levels of classical scholarship for decades, and it has not been resolved. The evidence supports elements of both readings and the possibility that the frieze was deliberately designed to sustain multiple simultaneous interpretations, to mean different things to different viewers depending on their knowledge and their angle of approach, cannot be dismissed. The ancient Greeks were sophisticated enough in their use of artistic ambiguity that such layered meaning will be entirely consistent with what we know of their aesthetic practice. Another profound and enduring mystery surrounds the fate of the great chrysophanon statue of Athena Parthenos, the 12-meter figure of ivory and gold that stood at the center of the Parthenon's inner chamber and was, by all ancient accounts, one of the supreme masterpieces of the ancient world. The statue is known to have survived into the late Roman period. Ancient writers describe it as still standing in the 4th century CE. After that, the historical record falls silent. The statue simply disappears from the sources, and its ultimate fate is unknown. Was it destroyed by fire? Melted down for its gold during a period of financial crisis? Removed to Constantinople and lost there? The questions have no definitive answers, and the absence of any physical trace of an object so enormous and so celebrated is itself one of the great unsolved puzzles of ancient history. The mysteries of the Acropolis extend beyond questions of interpretation and lost objects into the realm of active scholarly controversy over matters that might seem, on the surface, to be settled. The question of the original appearance of the classical monuments, specifically the question of how extensively and how vividly they were painted, has been substantially revised in recent decades by advances in the scientific analysis of surviving paint traces, but the full picture remains uncertain and contested. We know the buildings were painted. We have identified specific pigments: Egyptian blue, red ochre, yellow ochre, cinnabar, on surviving fragments. We have some sense of the color schemes applied to specific architectural elements. But the overall visual effect of the painted Acropolis, what it actually looked like to an ancient Athenian standing before the Propylaea and looking up at the blazing polychrome temples above, remains a matter of informed reconstruction rather than established fact, and different scholars and different reconstruction projects produce results that vary considerably in their intensity and their character. There is also the unresolved and deeply politically charged controversy over the ownership and ultimate disposition of the Acropolis sculptures scattered across the museums of Europe, a controversy that extends well beyond the specific case of the Elgin Marbles in London to include fragments held in Paris, Copenhagen, Vienna, Palermo, and elsewhere. The legal, ethical, and cultural dimensions of this controversy are genuinely complex, involving questions of international law, museum ethics, national sovereignty, and the nature of cultural heritage that do not admit of easy resolution. What is clear is that the controversy is not going away, and that it raises questions about the relationship between powerful cultural institutions and the communities whose heritage they hold that will define debates about museum ethics and cultural property for generations to come. And finally, there is a mystery of a more intimate and more human character, one that no amount of archaeological excavation or scholarly analysis can fully resolve. It is the mystery of individual experience. What did it feel like to be an ordinary Athenian citizen in the 5th century BCE, climbing the Acropolis on the day of the Panathenaic festival, surrounded by thousands of your fellow citizens, the smell of sacrificial smoke in the air, the sound of music and procession all around you, and above you the great marble temples gleaming in the Mediterranean sun with all their original color and all the full presence of their newly completed magnificence? What did Athena mean to you? Not as a theological abstraction, but as a living presence, a divine being whose protection you genuinely believe stood between your city and destruction? What did it feel like to live inside a civilization at the absolute peak of its creative powers? To be part of a generation that was building the monuments that all subsequent generations would look back on as the highest achievement of the human spirit? These questions have no answers. The inner lives of the ancient Athenians are beyond our reach, but the asking of them is itself a form of historical engagement, a refusal to treat the past as merely a collection of facts and objects, and an insistence on recognizing that the people who built the Acropolis were not archetypes or symbols, but fully realized human beings, living their lives with the same complexity and depth and emotional richness that we bring to our own. They were afraid and ambitious, proud and uncertain, capable of extraordinary generosity and extraordinary cruelty, driven by love and rivalry and a desire for meaning and the terror of death. They were, in the most fundamental sense, us. And the monuments they left behind are not artifacts of a vanished world, but mirrors, surfaces in which, if we look carefully enough and honestly enough, we can see our own reflection staring back at us across the full depth of human time. Modern Greece is a country of approximately 10.5 million people, occupying the southernmost tip of the Balkan Peninsula and a vast archipelago of more than 6,000 islands scattered across the Aegean and Ionian seas. It is a member of the European Union and the Eurozone, a parliamentary republic with a democratic constitution, a country whose landscape ranges from the sun-bleached marble of its ancient ruins to the snow-capped peaks of its northern mountains, from the crystalline blue of its island waters to the dense urban fabric of its capital city. It is, by any measure, a country of extraordinary natural and cultural wealth. And yet, for much of the early 21st century, it has also been a country defined in the international imagination by economic crisis, by the sovereign debt emergency that began in 2010 and subjected the Greek people to more than a decade of austerity, unemployment, and painful structural adjustment. Understanding the role of the Acropolis and of cultural tourism more broadly in the modern Greek economy requires holding both of these realities simultaneously. The extraordinary richness of Greece's cultural inheritance and the very real economic vulnerabilities of the nation that is its steward. Tourism is, by a considerable margin, the single most important sector of the Greek economy. In the years immediately preceding the global disruptions of the early 2020s, tourism accounted for approximately 20% of Greece's gross domestic product and supported, directly and indirectly, roughly 1 in 5 jobs in the country. Greece receives between 30 and 33 million international visitors per year in strong years, a number that, for a country of 10.5 million people, represents one of the highest ratios of visitors to residents of any nation on Earth. These visitors come for the islands, for the beaches, for the food and the climate and the quality of Mediterranean life. But they come, above all, for the history. And at the center of that history, literally and figuratively, stands the Acropolis. Athens itself has undergone a remarkable transformation in the 21st century from a city that international visitors historically passed through quickly on their way to the islands, to a destination in its own right, a city whose combination of ancient monuments, vibrant neighborhoods, excellent restaurants, and thriving art scene has made it one of the most compelling urban destinations in Europe. The neighborhoods surrounding the Acropolis have been at the center of this transformation. Monastiraki, with its ancient flea market and its view of the Roman agora below the Acropolis hill. Plaka, the oldest continuously inhabited neighborhood in Athens, its narrow streets winding through Ottoman-era and neoclassical buildings in the shadow of the sacred hill. Koukaki and Petrolona, formerly working-class neighborhoods that have become centers of independent restaurants, coffee shops, and creative businesses catering to the wave of younger visitors and digital nomads who have discovered Athens as a place not just to visit, but to live and work. The economic relationship between the Acropolis and the city around it is both straightforward and complex. At its most direct, the site generates significant revenue through ticket sales. The entrance fee for the Acropolis archaeological site, which includes access to the surrounding ancient agora and several other monuments, generates millions of euros annually, with a substantial portion directed toward the ongoing conservation and restoration work on the monuments themselves. The Acropolis Museum, since its opening in 2009, has become one of the most visited museums in Europe, adding further economic activity to the immediate neighborhood and supporting a constellation of hotels, restaurants, and retail businesses that have grown up around it. But the economic impact of the Acropolis on the Greek economy extends far beyond the direct revenue it generates. It functions as what economists call a driver attraction, a monument of such universal recognition and drawing power that it motivates visit decisions that then generate economic activity across the entire country. A traveler who comes to Athens to see the Acropolis may also visit the islands, the ancient theater of Epidaurus, the Oracle at Delphi, the Byzantine monuments of Thessaloniki. The Acropolis, in this sense, is not merely an attraction, but an ambassador, the most powerful single symbol of a country whose entire tourism offering rests on the foundation of an extraordinary cultural and natural heritage. This economic dependence on cultural tourism creates responsibilities and tensions that Greek policymakers and heritage managers navigate on a daily basis. The pressure to maximize visitor numbers and therefore revenue is in permanent tension with the conservation imperative to limit the physical impact of visitation on fragile ancient monuments. The desire to develop the tourism infrastructure around the Acropolis, new hotels, improved transport links, expanded visitor facilities, must be balanced against the archaeological reality that virtually any ground disturbance in central Athens reveals new layers of ancient material that must be carefully excavated and documented before construction can proceed. The ancient city is everywhere beneath the modern one, and the relationship between development and preservation in Athens is one of the most complex urban planning challenges in the world. The Greek government has, in recent years, invested significantly in efforts to extend the tourism season beyond the traditional summer peak, to distribute visitors more widely across the country's regions and monuments, and to develop forms of cultural tourism, academic travel, heritage tourism, experiential programs connecting visitors with living Greek cultural traditions that generate higher economic value while placing lower pressure on the most visited sites. These efforts have met with mixed success. The gravitational pull of the Acropolis in the Greek islands remains overwhelming, and the concentration of tourism in a small number of peak months and a small number of iconic locations continues to create both economic vulnerability and conservation stress. The COVID-19 pandemic of the early 2020s exposed with brutal clarity the degree to which the Greek economy had become dependent on international tourism. When visitor numbers collapsed almost to zero during the pandemic years, the economic impact on Greece was severe and immediate. Hotels closed, restaurants shuttered, the businesses of entire island communities ceased to function. The recovery, when it came, was rapid and robust, with visitor numbers returning to and in some years exceeding pre-pandemic levels with remarkable speed. But the experience reinforced the arguments of those economists and policymakers who have long argued that Greece's near-total dependence on tourism represents a structural vulnerability that requires diversification, that a modern European economy cannot sustainably rest on a foundation of ancient monuments and Mediterranean beaches alone, however extraordinary those assets may be. And yet those assets are genuinely extraordinary. The Acropolis alone draws visitors from every country on Earth. People who have carried the image of the Parthenon in their imagination for years or decades before they finally stand before it in person. For many of them, the experience exceeds their expectations, which is itself a remarkable thing, given how high those expectations invariably are. The hill delivers, the marble delivers, the light delivers. The sense of direct, physical contact with the deep roots of the civilization in which most of the modern world, whether it fully acknowledges it or not, is still firmly planted. That delivers, too, with a force and an immediacy that no photograph or documentary or history book can fully replicate.